Thank you, Connie. And thanks to Velocity, Modular Seattle, Patchworks for bringing me here. This is a fun place to be. So to start, I guess I will kind of briefly situate the XPO in the history of modular synthesizers and Make Noise as a company. So Make Noise started in 2008 and was one of the first Eurorack companies outside of Doepfer. And in the early years of Make Noise as a company, it wasn't primarily known for, it was not primarily known for audio sources in particular. The early kind of hits of Make Noise would include maths, the wired Wogglebug based on Grant Richter's design, pressure points, these are all more like control voltage sources that are in the lineage of various classic synthesizer circuits, and bringing those concepts into a modern modular system was kind of the big thing that Make Noise was doing in those early years. And it wasn't until 2011 that Make Noise made a module that was actually primarily an audio source, and that one even was a little unusual of one, which was the Phonogene, kind of a tape machine slash granular synthesis emulation that in fact didn't generate sound but required sound to be placed into it in order to have sound come out. So it wasn't actually till 2012 that an oscillator came out by Make Noise, so 10 years ago, the DPO, Dual Prismatic Oscillator. And at the time in the world of modular synthesizers, which was a little smaller than it is today, there was tons of speculation over what the DPO was going to be. What's a Make Noise oscillator going to be? And the name Dual Prismatic Oscillator indicates, unfortunately I don't have one here in this case, but briefly, it's a dual oscillator, so 2-in-1, and it follows kind of the paradigm of the Buchla 259, in which you have two oscillators that are designed to be modulating each other. But unlike the 259, the dual prismatic oscillator was a dual primary oscillator, the other version of that acronym that Tony sometimes used, which is to say that the two oscillators weren't really set up in a primary and modulator configuration, but rather both of them were supposed to be full oscillators in their own right, and the ways in which they interacted were different depending on which side you were modulating. One of them was a modulator for wave folders and such. The other one was a source for hard sync, that kind of stuff. So there were a lot of possible ways to sort of mesh these oscillators together into something like a prism. So timbre changes being viewed at various angles. Tony sometimes used the word lattice to describe this. The following year, in 2013, we released the STO, which is a single oscillator known as sub-timbral oscillator, and it's quite a bit simpler than the DPO. It's much more of you get some basic wave shapes on it, a sine wave, a sub-oscillator, and another sine wave. The sine wave on the left also has a shaping circuit that ripples through some even and odd harmonics, and we called that the now I've forgotten what it's called, the variable waveform output. The reason I've forgotten is because it lives on in the XPO now in a new way, which I'll get to in a moment. So anyway, the STO, it's meant to be a little more subtle and kind of melodic than the DPO in contrast, but it does have some unique timbre options as well on it. And in the years since, we have released quite a few modules, reworking some older classics, doing new versions of Modumix, Rene, Optimix, QMMG, adding clocking with Tempi, and added a lot of digital modules in collaboration with SoundHack, such as the Herbverb, Morphogene, Mimeophone, Telharmonic. And then we released tabletop devices like the Zero Coast, Zero Control, and Strega last year. And although there are analog VCOs in the Zero Coast and Strega, but we had not released a new analog VCO module since 2013. And so now I suppose it's time to do so. So the XPO is the stereo prismatic oscillator. And it has, unlike the STO with its 3 outputs, the XPO has 11 simultaneous outputs. There are 5 mono outputs along the top, and then 3 stereo pairs along the side. And let's just have a quick listen to each of them. The sine wave is the same as you'd find on STO or DPO. The triangle, a little more harmonic than the sine wave, a little more harmonics to it than the sine wave, a little bit buzzier, still a pretty pleasant basic waveform. The sawtooth, we had a sawtooth on the DPO that was based a little more on the Buchla 258 sawtooth, and this one is more of a pure sawtooth if you're the type of synth nerd who wants to know the very slight differences in sawtooth shapes. The spike wave has been utilized in the circuit of the DPO, but has generally not been available as its own output. It has much thinner kind of sound, buzzy. And then we have a sub-oscillator. This one is different from the sub-oscillator on the STO. Both of them are derived from the main core and give you octaves down and that thick, richer sound. And then we have 3 stereo. The pulse width modulated output. We have on the modulate left and right controls, we have pulse width control that can go to 0 or a flat line. And then on the left and on the right. The stereo timbre is based very much on the variable output from the DPO, or I'm sorry, from the STO, and it's also separate control on left and right. And this output, this pair of outputs is also controlled by the center parameter, which controls the left and right at the same time. And what this does is it crossfades between a sine wave and a sawtooth for the shaper that will then be affected by the modulator. And that too has its roots in the Buchla 158 and 258. And then finally, we have a wave-folded output with a left and right wave folder. This output is also affected by the center parameter, which instead of changing from a sine to a saw, as it does on the timbre, this changes the shape of the wave that's fed into the wave folder in kind of multiple ways at once, but is giving us some different shapes for the wave folders to act on. Let's modulate this a little bit. Does that sound all right? So that's kind of just a quick tour of the outputs of the XPO. Sorry, I need to know what time it is at all times here so I don't go super over. So I want to talk a little bit about how the modulators work in terms of stereo. So we have already shown how we have a left and a right modulation output. We take some inspiration from our stereo filter, the QPAS, in terms of how these work. So on the QPAS, which we released a couple of years ago, we have these parameters called radiate, and this is a 4-core filter with 2 cores on the left and 2 cores on the right. And the radiate controls will move the 2 cores on the left in opposite frequency directions from each other. And the other one does the same to the 2 right side cores. This is an attempt to create kind of a coherent stereo image that doesn't sound totally lopsided, like you have just everything weighed over to the left while the right isn't doing very much. And a trick to this that is included in the QPAS is that the modulation input on the left side is also normaled to the modulation input on the right side, as demonstrated by this gold arrow here. So if we begin to modulate the left radiate, that modulation depth is controlled by this attenuator here. We can modulate the right radiate using the same modulator, but in an independent depth and direction. And then all 4 cores are controlled at once by the frequency and resonance controls. So this gives us a lot of options for stereo depth that aren't just moving the sound from one side of the panorama to the other, but let us fill the whole spectrum, or the whole panorama, I guess, and widen it in interesting ways. Now, so for the XPO, we've set the module up to kind of look a lot like the QPAS in terms of the way it's laid out, because they're going to operate the same way in a lot of ways. So, for example, here, if I go ahead and open that filter and listen to the pulse width modulated outputs, as we noted, we have left and right control. We also have this same normalization of left and right. And the same will be true for all 3 of our stereo pair outputs. We can modulate both sides with a single control voltage, but in independent amounts. Now with the vary timbre and the folded output, we have a center parameter that affects both of them, as indicated by the gold lines that come up from the center parameter and through just those two pairs. And like the frequency and resonance controls on the QPAS, this affects the left and the right side equally. So we have a way to control the two sides independently while also having something that kind of ties them together. So I'll let it continue to modulate the vary timbre here. Now this parameter that I'm now modulating at audio rate on the center, it does not affect the pulse width modulator outputs. I can do whatever I want with center, and I don't hear it on the pulse width modulated output. So this is a nice way to separate the modulators from their destinations. It does affect, of course, the wave folding output. Yeah, so that kind of covers some of the timbre controls that we have on this oscillator. And then there's also a number of ways to control its frequency as well. We have an FM input. And this is a linear FM input. Something that it has on it that not a lot of single oscillators have is an FM depth control. So we can actually, there's a VCA in there that allows us to voltage control the FM depth. Kind of a little basic sequence there, but I think you get the idea. And then we also have a normalization on the FM input, which is coming from the sub-oscillator output. So basically any time we like, we can turn that up a little bit to sort of add some sub-harmonics to the sound, or crank it to get it less coherent. So we've aimed for kind of maximizing the possible ways to modulate the timbre on this module without wrecking the core frequency if you want to continue using it for melodies. And then, of course, FM and the volt per octave sequencing and such, that those will affect every single output because it's affecting the core's frequency. So FM things affect everything. The modulate parameters affect just the 3 stereo pairs, and the center parameter affects only the bottom 2 of the stereo pairs. So at any given time, there are ways to affect some of the outputs and not the other ones if you like to do that. So we also have a lot of options for how to patch the XPO with its neighbors, simply because we have so many outputs on it that you might not want to just be limited to listening to any given one of them at one time and having that all that it's doing. So with this small system, I'll focus on kind of patching it with QPAS a little bit, just give some ideas in terms of like how we might think about letting these different modules play together. As a core module for an instrument, an oscillator should really be able to be something that can reach a lot of different types of tones. It can go from smooth, pleasant, pretty to aggressive and harsh. It can go from simple sounds to very detailed, complex sounds, and it can go both powerful with punch and deep with more complexity and kind of rich stereo depth to it. So one popular thing to do will be to, let's see here, take one set of outputs and run it through something like the mimeophone. Separate output, like a sub oscillator, running through like QPAS. I don't have much monitoring, so I hope that sounded good. Let's see. Did I have another patch idea? Another thing that I really like to do is do some low-pass filtering with the QPAS. Filter out the upper frequencies, that can be a nice way to kind of shape the sound. It also pulls upper frequencies out in a way that makes it quite a bit less bright than we would have if the filter was all the way open. Now I find this spike wave to be a really nice modulation source for the filter, because what this wave does is, for most of the cycle, it's low, but for a very small portion of the cycle, it goes all the way high. And when we modulate a filter with that, we're going to get a little bit of high frequency sound built right back in. I feel like I can still get those kind of rich lower filter sweeps without entirely removing all of the upper spectrum from the sound there. Let's see now. I'd also like to talk a little bit about the difference between mono and stereo in a system, and like why you would use one or the other. Because so many times, for such a long time, modular synthesizers have mostly followed a mono signal path. And over the past few years, we've kind of started to find more and more ways to do stereo within the modular. And it sounds great a lot of the times, but mono still has its uses too. And in the XPO, with our stereo outputs, we have made the left outputs a little different from just being a single instance of what the stereo is, so that they can still be useful for specific reasons in your patch, or if you don't have as many stereo destinations as we have all these outputs there, for example. So I'm just going to briefly show how the different outputs differ from each other in terms of mono and stereo. So the pulse width modulated output, when we modulate left and right on this, it's got a sort of really wide field of what we're hearing there. Set up some automated modulation here. Now, if we take just the left output, there is a normalization on the right input that causes the left output to change when you patch it. So we have the two different pulse width modulation circuits on the two different outputs now. When I pull out the right cable, let's do it while we're listening to it. It stacks those two pulse width modulation circuits together, but it inverts one of them so that there are more places in the circuit where the pulse width modulation causes cancellation, and we have silence or extra small pulse width. And depending on kind of the rate of our modulator and how far it's affecting either of these two circuits, we can get these different they're almost like rhythms within the modulator here. I generally also find that this output has more punch to it than using both outputs together. Kind of like if you think about a polysynth or a monosynth, when you do that unison stacking of a whole bunch of oscillators playing the same note, it can add more punch to it, while sometimes taking away some of the depth of the sound. Now with the timbre outputs, a similar normalization takes place on the right output, so that an inverted version of it is mixed with the left when we pull into mono. I generally find that this one actually tends to be more thin sounding than the pulse width modulation when we take the mono version. In fact, to the point where the center parameters is very subtle, but we have similarly kind of ways that we can kind of punch holes in the sound with the modulator. Also, I mentioned earlier that I really like taking the spike wave to the QPAS to kind of bring in a little of that missing higher frequency. The different audio rate outputs that are coming from the XPO that are always in tune with each other can give us a lot of different flavors of modulation in the QPAS. With the QPAS 2, whether you're using one or both outputs is going to have an effect on the overall sound. When we use only the left output, it tends to be more aggressive. It's got all 4 cores stacked into both sides. I did the math on the number of mono and stereo inputs and outputs that you can patch through the QPAS. Let's see now. We have 3. We can patch in mono, stereo, or just the right output for each of the 3 XPO pairs. Then we have 3 types of filter cores from the QPAS. Multiply that by the 3 filter cores on the QPAS, plus add another output type on the smile pass. Well, I can keep going, but basically I found 150 different ways to patch either mono or stereo from XPO into QPAS, and that's without adding modulation to it. So together, I think it's got a lot of prismatic oscillation potential. Another thing we can do is patch them together in multiple directions. For example, if I take one of the bandpass outputs from the QPAS and use it to sync the XPO, patch to the sync input. The sync input is it's somewhere between a hard and a soft sync, so it tends to kind of try to catch up with the frequency that's coming into it. Right now it's not really doing very much because I have the resonance turned down on the QPAS, so what we're hearing is mostly just the same wave that's going through the QPAS. But if I turn up the resonance, those peaks are going to start causing the XPO to destabilize a little bit. Now I really like to give a little echo to this when I'm doing this particular patch. Like this because I can kind of get sort of an idea of the shape of what's going to happen, but I don't really know when or how it's going to happen exactly. Okay, that's a lot of patch cables. Let's break it back down. Let's see. Well, I think I only have a few minutes, so I guess I should open it up to questions if there are any before we do any last patching. Yes?
Both for octave inputs. Could you demonstrate something that uses both?
Yeah, absolutely. Good idea. Okay, so
You have 18 minutes.
oh, really? Okay. I thought I had 2 minutes. 18 is better. All right, that means I can patch like very slightly slower than I was before. I hope it's been coherent so far. Is that coherent? Okay, so let's try. Do a little melody here. Sorry for this being any out of tune. I did it on the fly. Go ahead and do a little micro rate modulation on the mimeophone as well. have a lot of, since this is a pretty small little system here, I don't have like a second channel of a sequencer or anything like that to run into my other Volcker octaves. So instead, I'm gonna take this end of cycle from this maths here, just an occasional gate. I'm gonna attenuate that. Stop that clock for a second. And patch that to the Volcker octave, the second one. I'm gonna try to tune it so that it's an octave here. What is it?
Time's up. There's a miscommunication.
Oh, I'm never gonna get those 3 minutes back. Okay, that's all right. I'll just finish this up real quick. I apologize for this being out of tune. I haven't gotten to tune them in with what I have. So there I'm using the other Volcker octave as kind of a trill. All right. Were there any more questions? We have time for one more question if there was one. Maybe there wasn't one.
I actually have one.
Okay.
Is this a new system that you guys are rolling out? Sort of like the microsound.
Yeah, TBD. I'm not sure exactly what the plan will be there. I do expect that we'll probably do a system with the XPO in it at some point.
Yeah.
We've kind of been playing around with some different configurations to
This
see
right
what
here
really
seems
works.
pretty powerful.
This is the one that Pete and I settled on when we were first starting to do videos with the XPO, and this skiff plus the zero control is pretty solid. I've been having a lot of fun patching it. Yeah. So, well, thanks everybody for coming and checking this out. Appreciate your time.